According to the economists themselves, it is neither the actual extent of social wealth, nor the magnitude of the capital already functioning, that lead to a rise of wages, but only the constant growth of accumulation and the degree of rapidity of that growth. So far, we have only considered one special phase of this process, that in which the increase of capital occurs along with a constant technical composition of capital. But the process goes beyond this phase. Once given the general basis of the capitalistic system, then, in the course of accumulation, a point is reached at which the development of the productivity of social labor becomes the most powerful lever of accumulation. The same cause, says Adam Smith, which raises the wages of labor, the increase of stock, tends to increase its productive powers and to make a smaller quantity of labor produce a greater quantity of work. Apart from natural conditions such as fertility of the soil, and then from the skill of independent and isolated producers, the degree of productivity of labor in a given society is expressed in the relative extent of the means of production that one laborer, during a given time, with the same tension of labor power, turns into products. The mass of the means of production which he thus transforms increases with the productiveness of his labor. But those means of production play a double part. The increase of some is a consequence, that of the others a condition of the increasing productivity of labor. With the division of labor in manufacture, and with the use of machinery, more raw material is worked up in the same time, and therefore, a greater mass of raw material and auxiliary substances enter into the labor process. That is the consequence of the increasing productivity of labor. On the other hand, the mass of machinery, beasts of burden, mineral manures, drain pipes, and is a condition of the increasing productivity of labor. So also is it with the means of production concentrated in buildings, furnaces, means of transport, and but whether condition or consequence, the growing extent of the means of production, as compared with the labor power incorporated with them, is an expression of the growing productiveness of labor. The increase of the latter appears, therefore, in the diminution of the mass of labor in proportion to the mass of means of production moved by it, or in the diminution of the subjective factor of the labor process as compared with the objective factor. This change in the technical composition of capital, this growth in the mass of means of production, as compared with the mass of the labor power that vivifies them, is reflected again in its value composition, by the increase of the constant constituent of capital at the expense of its variable constituent. There may be, originally percent, of a capital laid out in means of production, and percent in labor power, later on, with the development of the productivity of labor percent in means of production percent in labor power, and so on. This law of the progressive increase in constant capital, in proportion to the variable, is confirmed at every step by the comparative analysis of the prices of commodities, whether we compare different economic epochs or different nations in the same epoch. The relative magnitude of the element of price, which represents the value of the means of production only, or the constant part of capital consumed, is indirect. The relative magnitude of the other element of price that pays labor is in inverse proportion to the advance of accumulation. This diminution in the variable part of capital as compared with the constant, or the altered value composition of the capital, however, only shows approximately the change in the composition of its material constituents. The capital value employed today in spinning is divided by constant and divided by variable, whilst at the beginning of the 8th century it was a half constant and a half variable. On the other hand, the mass of raw material, instruments of labor, and that a certain quantity of spinning labor consumes productively today is many hundred times greater than at the beginning of the 8th century. The reason is simply that, with the increasing productivity of labor, not only does the mass of the means of production consumed by it increase, but their value compared with their mass diminishes. Their value therefore rises absolutely, but not in proportion to their mass. The increase of the difference between constant and variable capital is therefore much less than that of the difference between the mass of the means of production into which the constant, and the mass of the labor power into which the variable, capital, is converted. Former difference increases with the latter, but in a smaller degree. But if the progress of accumulation lessens the relative magnitude of the variable part of capital, it by no means, in doing this, excludes the possibility of a rise in its absolute magnitude. Suppose that a capital value at first is divided into percent of constant and percent of variable capital, later into percent of constant and percent of variable. If in the meantime the original capital, say pound, has increased to pound, its variable constituent has also increased. It was pound, it is now pound. But whereas formerly an increase of capital by percent would have sufficed to raise the demand for labor percent, now this latter rise requires a tripling of the original capital. In Part IV, it was shown how the development of the productiveness of social labor presupposes cooperation on a large scale, how it is only upon this supposition that division and combination of labor can be organized, and the means of production economized by concentration on a vast scale, how instruments of labor which, from their very nature, are only fit for use in common, such as a system of machinery, can be called into being, how huge natural forces can be pressed into the service of production, and how the transformation can be effected of the process of production into a technological application of science. On the basis of the production of commodities, where the means of production are the property of private persons, and where the artisan therefore either produces commodities, isolated from and independent of others, or sells his labor power as a commodity, because he lacks the means for independent industry, cooperation on a large scale can realize itself only in the increase of individual capital. Only in proportion as the means of social production and the means of subsistence are transformed into the private property of capitalists, the basis of the production of commodities can admit of production on a large scale in the capitalistic form alone. A certain accumulation of capital in the hands of individual producers of commodities forms therefore the necessary preliminary of the specifically capitalistic mode of production. We had therefore to assume that this occurs during the transition from handicraft to capitalistic industry. It may be called primitive accumulation because it is the historic basis, instead of the historic result of specifically capitalist production. How it itself originates, we need not here inquire as yet. It is enough that it forms the starting point. But all methods for raising the social productive power of labor that are developed on this basis are at the same time methods for the increased production of surplus value or surplus product, which in its turn is the formative element of accumulation. They are, therefore, at the same time methods of the production of capital by capital, or methods of its accelerated accumulation. The continual retransformation of surplus value into capital now appears in the shape of the increasing magnitude of the capital that enters into the process of production. This in turn is the basis of an extended scale of production, of the methods for raising the productive power of labor that accompany it, and of accelerated production of surplus value. If, therefore, a certain degree of accumulation of capital appears as a condition of the specifically capitalist mode of production, the latter causes conversely an accelerated accumulation of capital. With the accumulation of capital, therefore, the specifically capitalistic mode of production develops, and with the capitalist mode of production the accumulation of capital. Both these economic factors bring about, in the compound ratio of the impulses they reciprocally give one another, that change in the technical composition of capital by which the variable constituent becomes always smaller and smaller as compared with the constant. Every individual capital is a larger or smaller concentration of means of production, with a corresponding command over a larger or smaller labor arm. Every accumulation becomes the means of new accumulation. With the increasing mass of wealth which functions as capital, accumulation increases the concentration of that wealth in the hands of individual capitalists, and thereby widens the basis of production on a large scale and of the specific methods of capitalist production. The growth of social capital is affected by the growth of many individual capitals. All other circumstances remaining the same, individual capitals, and with them the concentration of the means of production, increase in such proportion as they form aliquot parts of the total social capital. At the same time, portions of the original capitals disengage themselves and function as new independent capital. Besides other causes, the division of property within capitalist families plays a great part in this. With the accumulation of capital, therefore, the number of capitalists grows to a greater or less extent. 2 points characterize this kind of concentration which grows directly out of, or rather is identical with, accumulation. First, the increasing concentration of the social means of production in the hands of individual capitalists is, other things remaining equal, limited by the degree of increase of social wealth. Second, the part of social capital domiciled in each particular sphere of production is divided among many capitalists who face one another as independent commodity producers competing with each other. Accumulation and the concentration accompanying it are therefore not only scattered over many points, but the increase of each functioning capital is thwarted by the formation of new and the subdivision of old capital. Accumulation, therefore, presents itself on the one hand as increasing concentration of the means of production, and of the command over labor, on the other, as repulsion of many individual capitals one from another. The splitting up of the total social capital into many individual capitals, or the repulsion of its fractions one from another, is counteracted by their attraction. This last does not mean that simple concentration of the means of production and of the command over labor, which is identical with accumulation. It is concentration of capitals already formed, destruction of their individual independence, expropriation of capitalist by capitalist, transformation of many small into few large capital. This process differs from the former in this, that it only presupposes a change in the distribution of capital already to hand, and functioning. Its field of action is therefore not limited by the absolute growth of social wealth, by the absolute limits of accumulation. Capital grows in one place to huge mass in a single hand, because it has in another place been lost by many. This is centralization proper, as distinct from accumulation and concentration. The laws of this centralization of capitals, or of the attraction of capital by capital, cannot be developed here. A brief hint at a few facts must suffice. The battle of competition is fought by cheapening of commodity. The cheapness of commodities demands, ceteris paribus, on the productiveness of labor, and this again on the scale of production. Therefore, the larger capitals beat the smaller. It will further be remembered that, with the development of the capitalist mode of production, there is an increase in the minimum amount of individual capital necessary to carry on a business under its normal condition. The smaller capitals, therefore, crowd into spheres of production which modern industry has only sporadically or incompletely got hold of. Here competition rages in direct proportion to the number, and in inverse proportion to the magnitudes, of the antagonistic capital. It always ends in the ruin of many small capitalists, whose capitals partly pass into the hands of their conquerors, partly vanish. Apart from this, with capitalist production an altogether new force comes into play, the credit system, which in its first stages furtively creeps in as the humble assistant of accumulation, drawing into the hands of individual or associated capitalists, by invisible threads, the money resources which lie scattered over the surface of society in larger or smaller amounts. But it soon becomes a new and terrible weapon in the battle of competition, and is finally transformed into an enormous social mechanism for the centralization of capital. Commensurately with the development of capitalist production and accumulation, there develop the two most powerful levers of centralization, competition and credit. At the same time, the progress of accumulation increases the material amenable to centralization, the individual capitals, whilst the expansion of capitalist production creates, on the one hand, the social want, and on the other, the technical means necessary for those immense industrial undertakings which require a previous centralization of capital for their accomplishment. Today, therefore, the force of attraction, drawing together individual capitals, and the tendency to centralization are stronger than ever before. But if the relative extension and energy of the movement towards centralization is determined, in a certain degree, by the magnitude of capitalist wealth and superiority of economic mechanism already attained, progress in centralization does not in any way depend upon a positive growth in the magnitude of social capital. And this is the specific difference between centralization and concentration, the latter being only another name for reproduction on an extended scale. Centralization may result from a mere change in the distribution of capitals already existing, from a simple alteration in the quantitative grouping of the component parts of social capital. Your capital can grow into powerful masses in a single hand, because there it has been withdrawn from many individual hands. In any given branch of industry, centralization would reach its extreme limit if all the individual capitals invested in it were fused into a single capital. In a given society, the limit would be reached only when the entire social capital was united in the hands of either a single capitalist or a single capitalist company. Centralization completes the work of accumulation by enabling industrial capitalists to extend the scale of their operation. Whether this latter result is the consequence of accumulation or centralization, whether centralization is accomplished by the violent method of annexation, when certain capitals become such preponderant centers of attraction for others that they shatter the individual cohesion of the latter, and then draw the separate fragments to themselves, or whether the fusion of a number of capitals already formed or in process of formation takes place by the smoother process of organizing joint stock company. The economic effect remains the same. Everywhere the increased scale of industrial establishments is the starting point for a more comprehensive organization of the collective work of many, for a wider development of their material motive forces. In other words, for the progressive transformation of isolated processes of production, carried on by customary methods, into processes of production socially combined and scientifically arranged. But accumulation, the gradual increase of capital by reproduction as it passes from the circular to the spiral form, is clearly a very slow procedure compared with centralization, which has only to change the quantitative groupings of the constituent parts of social capital. The world would still be without railways if it had had to wait until accumulation had got a few individual capitals far enough to be adequate for the construction of a railway. Centralization, on the contrary, accomplished this in the twinkling of an eye by means of joint stock company. And while centralization thus intensifies and accelerates the effects of accumulation, it simultaneously extends and speeds those revolutions in the technical composition of capital, which raise its constant portion at the expense of its variable portion, thus diminishing the relative demand for labor. The masses of capital fused together overnight by centralization reproduce and multiply as the others do, only more rapidly, thereby becoming new and powerful levers in social accumulation. Therefore, when we speak of the progress of social accumulation, we tacitly include, today, the effects of centralization. The additional capitals formed in the normal course of accumulation serve particularly as vehicles for the exploitation of new inventions and discoveries, and industrial improvements in general. But in time, the old capital also reaches the moment of renewal from top to toe, when it sheds its skin and is reborn like the others in a perfected technical form, in which a smaller quantity of labor will suffice to set in motion a larger quantity of machinery and raw material. The absolute reduction in the demand for labor which necessarily follows from this is obviously so much the greater the higher the degree in which the capitals undergoing this process of renewal are already massed together by virtue of the centralization movement. On the one hand, therefore, the additional capital formed in the course of accumulation attracts fewer and fewer laborers in proportion to its magnitude. On the other hand, the old capital, periodically reproduced with change of composition, repels more and more of the laborers formerly employed by it. The accumulation of capital, though originally appearing as its quantitative extension only, is effected, as we have seen, under a progressive qualitative change in its composition, under a constant increase of its constant, at the expense of its variable constituent. The specifically capitalist mode of production, the development of the productive power of labor corresponding to it, and the change thence resulting in the organic composition of capital, do not merely keep pace with the advance of accumulation or with the growth of social wealth. They develop at a much quicker rate, because mere accumulation, the absolute increase of the total social capital, is accompanied by the centralization of the individual capitals of which that total is made up, and because the change in the technological composition of the additional capital goes hand in hand with a similar change in the technological composition of the original capital. With the advance of accumulation, therefore, the proportion of constant to variable capital changes. If it was originally, say, it now becomes successively, and so that, as the capital increases, instead of a half of its total value, only divided by, and is transformed into labor power, and on the other hand, divided by, into means of production. Since the demand for labor is determined not by the amount of capital as a whole, but by its variable constituent alone, that demand falls progressively with the increase of the total capital, instead of, as previously assumed, rising in proportion to it. It falls relatively to the magnitude of the total capital, and at an accelerated rate as this magnitude increases. With the growth of the total capital, its variable constituent, or the labor incorporated in it, also does increase, but in a constantly diminishing proportion. The intermediate pauses are shortened, in which accumulation works as simple extension of production on a given technical basis. It is not merely that an accelerated accumulation of total capital, accelerated in a constantly growing progression, is needed to absorb an additional number of laborers, or even, on account of the constant metamorphosis of old capital, to keep employed those already functioning. In its turn, this increasing accumulation and centralization becomes a source of new changes in the composition of capital, of a more accelerated diminution of its variable, as compared with its constant constituent. This accelerated relative diminution of the variable constituent, that goes along with the accelerated increase of the total capital, and moves more rapidly than this increase, takes the inverse form, at the other pole, of an apparently absolute increase of the laboring population, an increase always moving more rapidly than that of the variable capital or the means of employment. But in fact, it is capitalistic accumulation itself that constantly produces, and produces in the direct ratio of its own energy and extent, a relatively redundant population of laborers, a population of greater extent than suffices for the average needs of the self-expansion of capital, and therefore a surplus population. Considering the social capital in its totality, the movement of its accumulation now causes periodical changes, affecting it more or less as a whole, now distributes its various phases simultaneously over the different spheres of production. In some spheres, a change in the composition of capital occurs without increase of its absolute magnitude, as a consequence of simple centralization. In others, the absolute growth of capital is connected with absolute diminution of its variable constituent, or of the labor power absorbed by it. In others again, capital continues growing for a time on its given technical basis, and attracts additional labor power in proportion to its increase, while at other times it undergoes organic change, lessens its variable constituent. In all spheres, the increase of the variable part of capital, and therefore of the number of laborers employed by it, is always connected with violent fluctuations and transitory production of surplus population, whether this takes the more striking form of the repulsion of laborers already employed, or the less evident but not less real form of the more difficult absorption of the additional laboring population through the usual channel. The magnitude of social capital already functioning, and the degree of its increase, with the extension of the scale of production, and the mass of the laborers set in motion, with the development of the productiveness of their labor, with the greater breadth and fullness of all sources of wealth, there is also an extension of the scale on which greater attraction of laborers by capital is accompanied by their greater repulsion, the rapidity of the change in the organic composition of capital, and in its technical form increases, and an increasing number of spheres of production becomes involved in this change, now simultaneously, now alternately. The laboring population therefore produces, along with the accumulation of capital produced by it, the means by which it itself is made relatively superfluous, is turned into a relative surplus population, and it does this to an always increasing extent. This is a law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production, and in fact, every special historic mode of production has its own special laws of population, historically valid within its limits, and only in so far as man has not interfered with them. Suppose, says H. Merivale, formerly professor of political economy at Oxford, subsequently employed in the English Colonial Office, suppose that, on the occasion of some of these crises, the nation were to rouse itself to the effort of getting rid by emigration of some hundreds of thousands of superfluous arms, what would be the consequence? That at the first returning demand for labor, there would be a deficiency. However rapid reproduction may be, it takes, at all events, the space of a generation to replace the loss of adult labor. Now, the profits of our manufacturers depend mainly on the power of making use of the prosperous moment when demand is brisk, and thus compensating themselves for the interval during which it is slack. This power is secured to them only by the command of machinery and of manual labor. They must have hands ready by them, they must be able to increase the activity of their operations when required, and to slacken it again, according to the state of the market, or they cannot possibly maintain that preeminence in the race of competition on which the wealth of the country is founded. Even Malthus recognizes overpopulation as a necessity of modern industry, though, after his narrow fashion, he explains it by the absolute overgrowth of the laboring population, not by their becoming relatively supernumerary. He says, prudential habits with regard to marriage, carried to a considerable extent among the laboring class of a country mainly depending upon manufactures and commerce, might injure it. From the nature of a population, an increase of laborers cannot be brought into market in consequence of a particular demand till after the lapse of years, and the conversion of revenue into capital, by saving, may take place much more rapidly. A country is always liable to an increase in the quantity of the funds for the maintenance of labor faster than the increase of population. After political economy has thus demonstrated the constant production of a relative surplus population of laborers to be a necessity of capitalistic accumulation, she very aptly, in the guise of an old maid, puts in the mouth of her beau ideal of a capitalist the following words addressed to those supernumeraries thrown on the streets by their own creation of additional capital. We manufacturers do what we can for you, whilst we are increasing that capital on which you must subsist. You must do the rest by accommodating your numbers to the means of subsistence. Capitalist production can by no means content itself with the quantity of disposable labor power which the natural increase of population yields. It requires for its free play an industrial reserve army independent of these natural limits. Up to this point, it has been assumed that the increase or diminution of the variable capital corresponds rigidly with the increase or diminution of the number of laborers employed. The number of laborers commanded by capital may remain the same, or even fall, while the variable capital increases. This is the case if the individual laborer yields more labor, and therefore his wages increase, and this, although the price of labor remains the same or even falls, only more slowly than the mass of labor rises. Increase of variable capital in this case becomes an index of more labor, but not of more laborers employed. It is the absolute interest of every capitalist to press a given quantity of labor out of a smaller, rather than a greater number of laborers, if the cost is about the same. In the latter case, the outlay of constant capital increases in proportion to the mass of labor set in action. In the former, that increase is much smaller. The more extended the scale of production, the stronger this motive. Its force increases with the accumulation of capital. We have seen that the development of the capitalist mode of production and of the productive power of labor, at once the cause and effect of accumulation, enables the capitalist, with the same outlay of variable capital, to set in action more labor by greater exploitation of each individual labor power. We have further seen that the capitalist buys with the same capital a greater mass of labor power, as he progressively replaces skilled laborers by less skilled, mature labor power by immature, male by female, that of adults by that of young persons or children. On the one hand, therefore, with the progress of accumulation, a larger variable capital sets more labor in action without enlisting more laborers. On the other, a variable capital of the same magnitude sets in action more labor with the same mass of labor power, and finally, a greater number of inferior labor powers by displacement of higher. The production of a relative surplus population, or the setting free of laborers, goes on therefore yet more rapidly than the technical revolution of the process of production that accompanies, and is accelerated by, the advance of accumulation, and more rapidly than the corresponding diminution of the variable part of capital as compared with the constant. If the means of production, as they increase in extent and effective power, become to a less extent means of employment of laborers, this state of things is again modified by the fact that in proportion as the productiveness of labor increases, capital increases its supply of labor more quickly than its demand for labor. The overwork of the employed part of the working class swells the ranks of the reserve, whilst conversely the greater pressure that the latter by its competition exerts on the former forces these to submit to overwork and to subjugation under the dictates of capital. The condemnation of one part of the working class to enforced idleness by the overwork of the other part, and the converse, becomes a means of enriching the individual capitalists, and accelerates at the same time the production of the industrial reserve army on a scale corresponding with the advance of social accumulation. How important is this element in the formation of the relative surplus population is shown by the example of England. Her technical means for saving labor are colossal. Nevertheless, if tomorrow morning labor generally were reduced to a rational amount, and proportioned to the different sections of the working class according to age and sex, the working population to hand would be absolutely insufficient for the carrying on of national production on its present scale. The great majority of the laborers now unproductive would have to be turned into productive ones. Taking them as a whole, the general movements of wages are exclusively regulated by the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army, and these again correspond to the periodic changes of the industrial cycle. They are, therefore, not determined by the variations of the absolute number of the working population, but by the varying proportions in which the working class is divided into active and reserve army, by the increase or diminution in the relative amount of the surplus population, by the extent to which it is now absorbed, now set free. For modern industry with its decennial cycles and periodic phases, which, moreover, as accumulation advances, are complicated by irregular oscillations following each other more and more quickly, that would indeed be a beautiful law, which pretends to make the action of capital dependent on the absolute variation of the population, instead of regulating the demand and supply of labor by the alternate expansion and contraction of capital, the labor market now appearing relatively underfull. Because capital is expanding, now again overfull because it is contracting. Yet this is the dogma of the economists. According to them, wages rise in consequence of accumulation of capital. The higher wages stimulate the working population to more rapid multiplication, and this goes on until the labor market becomes too full, and therefore capital, relatively to the supply of labor, becomes insufficient. Wages fall, and now we have the reverse of the medal. The working population is little by little decimated as the result of the fall in wages, so that capital is again in excess relatively to them. Or, as others explain it, falling wages and the corresponding increase in the exploitation of the labor again accelerates accumulation, whilst, at the same time, the lower wages hold the increase of the working class in check. Then comes again the time when the supply of labor is less than the demand, wages rise, and so on. A beautiful mode of motion this for developed capitalist production. Before, in consequence of the rise of wages, any positive increase of the population really fit for work could occur. The time would have been passed again and again, during which the industrial campaign must have been carried through, the battle fought and won. Between and a rise of wages practically insignificant, though accompanied by falling prices of corn, took place in the English agricultural districts. In Wiltshire, the weekly wages rose from to in Dorsetshire from or to, and this was the result of an unusual exodus of the agricultural surplus population caused by the demands of war, the vast extension of railroads, factories, mines, and the lower the wages, the higher is the proportion in which ever so insignificant a rise of them expresses itself. If the weekly wage is, and it rises to, that is a rise of percent, but if it is only, and it rises to, that is a rise of divided by percent, which sounds very fine. Everywhere the farmers were howling, and the London Economist, with reference to these starvation wages, prattled quite seriously of a general and substantial advance. What did the farmers do now? Did they wait until, in consequence of this brilliant remuneration, the agricultural laborers had so increased and multiplied that their wages must fall again, as prescribed by the dogmatic economic brain? They introduced more machinery, and in a moment the laborers were redundant again in a proportion satisfactory even to the farmers. There was now more capital laid out in agriculture than before, and in a more productive form. With this the demand for labor fell, not only relatively but absolutely. The above economic fiction confuses the laws that regulate the general movement of wages, or the ratio between the working class, the total labor power, and the total social capital, with the laws that distribute the working population over the different spheres of production. If, in consequence of favorable circumstances, accumulation in a particular sphere of production becomes especially active, and profits in it, being greater than the average profits, attract additional capital, of course the demand for labor rises and wages also rise. The higher wages draw a larger part of the working population into the more favored sphere, until it is glutted with labor power, and wages at length fall again to their average level or below it, if the pressure is too great. Then, not only does the immigration of laborers into the branch of industry in question cease, it gives place to their emigration. Here the political economist thinks he sees the why and wherefore of an absolute increase of workers accompanying an increase of wages, and of a diminution of wages accompanying an absolute increase of laborers. But he sees really only the local oscillation of the labor market in a particular sphere of production. He sees only the phenomena accompanying the distribution of the working population into the different spheres of outlay of capital, according to its varying needs. The industrial reserve army, during the periods of stagnation and average prosperity, weighs down the active labor army. During the periods of overproduction and paroxysm, it holds its pretensions in check. Relative surplus population is therefore the pivot upon which the law of demand and supply of labor works. It confines the field of action of this law within the limits absolutely convenient to the activity of exploitation and to the domination of capital. This is the place to return to one of the grand exploits of economic apologetics. It will be remembered that if through the introduction of new or the extension of old machinery, a portion of variable capital is transformed into constant, the economic apologist interprets this operation which capital, and by that very act sets laborers in exactly the opposite way, pretending that it sets free capital for the laborers. Only now can one fully understand the effrontery of these apologists. What are set free are not only the laborers immediately turned out by the machines, but also their future substitutes in the rising generation, and the additional contingent that with the usual extension of trade on the old basis would be regularly absorbed. They are now all and every new bit of capital looking out for employment can dispose of them. Whether it attracts them or others, the effect on the general labor demand will be nil, if this capital is just sufficient to take out of the market as many laborers as the machines threw upon it. If it employs a smaller number, that of the supernumeraries increases. If it employs a greater, the general demand for labor only increases to the extent of the excess of the employed over those the impulse that additional capital, seeking an outlet, would otherwise have given to the general demand for labor, is therefore in every case neutralized to the extent of the laborers thrown out of employment by the machine. That is to say, the mechanism of capitalistic production so manages matters that the absolute increase of capital is accompanied by no corresponding rise in the general demand for labor. And this the apologist calls a compensation for the misery, the sufferings, the possible death of the displaced laborers during the transition period that banishes them into the industrial reserve army. The demand for labor is not identical with increase of capital, nor supply of labor with increase of the working class. It is not a case of two independent forces working on one another. Les deux sont pépés.